Hey everyone, today we are talking about catching smallmouth bass on the river during the summertime. And I think any smallmouth angler knows that this time of year you can catch fish in just about any kind of water. That's what makes fishing during this season so fun. But just because fish may be spread across a lot of different habitat in the summer, it doesn't necessarily mean that finding the big ones is easy. So I've put together 5 points about summer locations and patterns that are hopefully going to put you on a better quality fish this summer, of course, in moving water. My first point has to do with where you start your day fishing. So the next time you go out, I want you to start fishing slack water or slow flow areas. I've fished rivers all over the country, and one thing that I've found is that fish often start their days in slower water. Sometimes these areas are larger pieces of water, let's say behind islands, and other times they're just small little pockets behind certain types of cover. And that's what we're looking at here, just a tree that pushes out into some heavier current, has some isolated current breaks, underwater of course, and then has slower water pushing up against the bank. Now as a river angler, you're probably just going to pick this apart and figure it out yourself, and that's okay. I just don't want you to spend too much time focusing on that current seam, and I do want you to pitch a lot more into that slack and that real shallow stuff first thing in the morning. A pattern that I've picked up on all across the country that's worth mentioning here is that fish don't necessarily need to be tight to any sort of cover at this time in the morning, especially with low light conditions. So pay attention to this next catch and see what's going on. Alright, so let's take a closer look at where this fish came from in an attempt to figure out why it was hanging out right there at this time of day. The first thing that jumps out at me is the amount of shade. In short, shade is always going to be your friend, but just up above, if we look, we can see that there's a grass point that sticks out pretty far into the river channel. And behind that, there is definitely a slow flow area. I wouldn't go as far to call it slack, but it is definitely a reduced flow compared to that center channel out over on the right. Now these kinds of areas come in all shapes and sizes, and you might find that the fish have a preference for one kind over the other. For example, they might be hanging out in an eddy that has some circular flow, or they might be hanging out in just a reduced flow area like we saw previously. Lots of different options, but definitely check them out and think slack in the morning to start. So this next point has to do with how fish location can change throughout the day and how different fish are simply doing different things even at the same time of day. So let's say you started off your morning, you fished slack, you were catching them good, but the sun is up now, you want to find some in current, but you're just not finding them there. So where are they? I tend to find them this time of day near to a couple important things. The first is going to be shade. The second is going to be that heavier current. And then a third, a bonus, is that if there is any sort of submerged cover or current break that they can hide beside, they can easily push out into the current and snatch anything that might float by. Now that I've told you guys what I'm generally looking for, let's go fishing for a little bit.
Oh, you. Got one. They're along this bank.
So what we're looking at here is a piece of cover that's on a bank that has a lot of what I just mentioned: shade, proximity to current, and a lot of underwater structure. And not only did I catch a fish off of this specific piece of cover, there's already another fish that moved up into it if you look closely. Personally, these areas are much easier to fish if you're facing upstream and also moving upstream, so that's what I'm doing here. As far as lures go, I want to drift something down, so I'm just drifting down a big TRD on a 1/8 ounce head. Depending on the mood of the fish, I might also swim a swim jig along all the wood and into the shade and run it through the grass and just kind of knock it off every cover type I can.
Oh no!
I hope y'all enjoyed my dramatic yell, but here I'm going to show you two different catches that are two different species of fish, one a smallmouth, one being a pike, and I want you just to take a look at the proximity to flow and let that tell you what kind of fish it's going to be. And a hint for those people who may not have to deal with pesky pike, they tend to like super slack, ultra protected areas. Alright, so I'm sure those of you who fish northern rivers had the answer immediately. If we compare the two areas, one has flow pushing up alongside it, has shade, not a ton of cover, but there was definitely some submerged cover. And then the other catch happened right behind a log, super shallow water, tighter to the bank on an inside turn with no current at all. So that's where the pike was hanging out. That's the kind of spot that you can fish, but generally you're going to find pike, especially in the middle of the day, hanging out in those no flow, grassy, woody areas. Conversely, smallmouth want to be at least close to the flow, even if they're not actually out in the current. As far as tactics go for fishing these kinds of areas, especially open areas like this one, I'm going to be throwing a whopper plopper over the top about 99% of the time. If the fish misses that, I do have a follow-up bait, but my clear preference is fishing these areas with a quicker moving lure. Alright, with areas adjacent to fast current in mind, I'm going to let you in on something that I think is a big fish producer this time of year almost no matter what, and that is these little cuts or branches off of the main channel that are through flows that again rejoin with the main channel. These areas often have micro eddies or some very small slack pockets that are close to the main current, and in my opinion these smaller areas that are only big enough to hold a fish or two are really where the big ones like to hang out. I've said this over and over again, but tiny micro spots are going to hold your bigger fish, or at least they do in my experience. So let's take a look at one of these tiny cuts and see where the big one's hanging out. So now that we plucked a nice 19-incher out of this, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this area. And if we look at the catch again, you'll notice how close to the current this fish was. And of course, bonus, there was shade and reeds right there. So there are a couple reasons why I like fishing areas like this for summer smallmouth. And the first is going to be that they are current concentrators. If you look on the left and right, we can see that we have two channels with concentrated current, and this fish did not come out of the current directly. Instead, it came out of an area adjacent to that stronger current. So when you have little cuts like this, it concentrates the current right in the middle of those, and the fish like to push out along the sides and snatch anything that comes by. Now, there are two other reasons that I really like areas like this, and the first is going to be that they're usually shaded because they're so small. Whatever's growing around on the sides is going to provide that shade cover, and then on top of that, in this example, we have reeds, and if you don't already know, smallmouth will push up underneath those a lot farther than you think, and these are excellent hunting areas, excellent ambush spots. They're just generally super fishy. Lesson 3 is pretty simple and straightforward, but I do want to point out that even though it is more likely that fish will move out into the current as the sun gets higher, not all fish do the same thing, and not all fish do the same thing at the same time of day. So even though this might be a go-to midday area for some fish, it doesn't mean all the fish are going to be there. So I'm going to leave you guys with the catch, and then we're going to talk about an area that I think is really good for finding fish in the current. Every time when I look down. Feisty one. Even though that last fish may have been a little bit closer to the bank and a piece of cover, it was still in pretty heavy current, or at least it came out into the current to feed, and that's why finding those areas adjacent to the current is so important. But sometimes fish will just straight up be in the current. So this next zone is an area where I had a huge blow up, didn't get it on camera, but wanted to fish it thoroughly. And what makes this spot in the current so good is that there are varying levels of current. So there'll be bands of heavy current, bands of slow current, bands of slack water or near slack water. When you have all of those changes in a close area, there are going to be fish hanging out on the transitions. Some might be in the faster water, some might be in the slower water, but you need to pull something across all of it in order to get a bite. Lesson 4 is just a point that I put together that kind of summarizes all of the important aspects of the spots that we've already gone over. Again, because smallmouth can be found in so many different types of water on a summer day in the river, it's important just to look for factors in combination with one another that really point to certain spots standing out from the rest. One classic summer smallmouth spot that combines all of the things we just mentioned is a bridge. Bridges provide faster concentrations of current, slower water around the sides, shade, and plenty of submerged and emergent cover that is accumulated over the course of the year. So if you're new to river smallmouth fishing, bridges are an excellent place to start. And you don't really have to overthink it as far as the lures go. Anything that you can toss up and bring back to you is going to catch fish if they're there. But one of my preferences for fishing bridges is just slow dragging a dark colored jig. Another killer area for catching summer smallmouth, and big ones at that, is going to be cut bank. There are some sections of river where cut bank is going to be the only place you find those bigger fish. I'm not sure why it is. I have my theories, but let's get into a couple catches before we talk about them. $20 it's a pike. What? $20 it's a pike. Wacky.
God, did you see how high that thing jumped?
See, that's what mine fucking doing.
Don't you come off. Oh, that's a big one. Thing jumped so high.
One of the hard parts about identifying the best cut bank is that it's not really above the surface of the water that tells the story. It's what goes on below that really matters the most. If you're not familiar with this kind of bank, it's where the current has actually eroded the land or the bank itself underneath the surface of the water so that it's actually cut out further than maybe what you're seeing on top. In addition to this, it tends to have some sort of grass that hangs out into the river channel itself, which provides another layer of protection for fish that are cruising alongside it. Because it's the current that creates a cut bank in the first place, they tend to be in higher flow areas, but you can generally find small changes either in the contour or the curvature of the bank that provide little pockets that the fish can hide in and jump out to ambush prey. On this bank alone, not only were there fish tucked into these pockets, but there were fish cruising, and Scott and I, between the two of us, caught 3 fish over 19 in this one little 20-yard stretch alone. So the last point that I want to leave you guys with is just to not overlook a cover that you know looks fishy. In the summer, it can be difficult because the fish can be so spread out doing such different things on the same day that you might start just zeroing in on one thing. And while you should do that, developing a pattern is always a good thing. Don't overlook that obvious cover, that one big laydown that's sticking way out into the channel. Give it a shot and you can still clean up a few fish doing that. Alright guys, that is going to do it for today's video. Thanks for coming along. I hope you can put a few of these lessons into practice and catch not only more fish, but bigger river smallmouth. Summer is a great time to be out there fishing. It may be a little tougher to find the big ones this time of year, but they are still very much catchable. So go ahead, get out on the river, have a little fun. See you next time.